If everybody could just take their seats, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dean Martha Minow. Dean Minow is an expert on just about every area of the law. It's kind of intimidating. But among her other expertise, she's also an expert on funding and fundraising, not just because of the law school, because of her work for the Legal Services Corporation. So she's somebody who has dealt with financial conflicts of interest in basically every aspect that they face the modern research university, and we're very lucky to have her say a few words for us.
Well, nothing like someone who missed the morning to come in and tell you why what you're doing is important, but that's what my role is. So there are three reasons why this is such an important gathering, and I will illustrate that with three cartoons. The first is one of my absolute favorite from the New Yorker, which shows someone praying at the edge of his bed saying, "Lord, please protect me from the appearance of impropriety." The serious point is that the appearance of conflicts of interest jeopardizes the most crucial asset that we have as a research university, which is the reputation for trustworthy work. The second favorite cartoon shows a man with a very large nose and a big mustache who's a judge, and he's looking down at a man with the identical nose and identical mustache, looks down from the bench and says, "Obviously not guilty." So what's the reason there? We have a risk of biases that we don't even know that we have. And this affects the pursuit of truth and justice all the time. And the challenge that's accentuated, but by no means unique, from financial conflicts of interest is that we may not even understand the degree to which it affects our judgment. So it's a deep and serious problem requiring serious and free inquiry, which is what this group represents, what this effort represents. We are inevitably conflicted. Derek Bach just said to me, "I have no idea where there's institutional conflicts of interest everywhere you look." It's absolutely true. And conflicts of interest, frankly, this has actually been part of my own scholarship and teaching. Conflicts of interest actually are just the tip of the iceberg about the limitations of our own perspective on what we claim to be our objectivity. And so I don't use the word objectivity because we're not objective. We're all positioned. We all have a point of view. I do believe that through the academic institution and the traditions of our crafts, we have developed practices, rituals, codes to guard against the biases that we are not always aware of, but we are not always aware of the biases that we're trying to guard against. And when you write a case study about a corporate merger in collaboration with the participants and their willing and generous cooperation, how does that affect your ability to have, quote, an objective view about what happened? How does financial support for tort reform or banking regulation affect consciously or unconsciously the reformers' views? This is an issue at this institution. This is an issue in every institution I know. The risk is not just that we don't know our biases. The risk is also that we may come to doubt ourselves so much that we're paralyzed and can't even say anything. That's a real risk too. I taught a course with Peter Gallison in the university a few years ago called The Production of Doubt in Law and Science. And we took three case studies. One was evolution and the debate over whether it exists. One was tobacco and the debate over its regulation. And the third was global climate change. As we studied the standards for doubt in science and compared them with the standards for doubt in law, what was, I think, most terrifying to us was discover the arbitrage between them, how people could manipulate the different way in which lawyers think about doubt in order to cast doubt on the science. And then, something that I don't think I'll ever forget, the industries that were in the business of casting doubt on the link between tobacco and cancer, the very industries, the very names of the quote-unquote scholars, the pseudoscientists, migrated over to be casting doubt on the human contribution to global climate change. The same people. There are industries of doubt. And the jeopardy is if research universities do not retain the ability to have real science to counter this pseudoscience, we're in real trouble. Third cartoon. There's some people in a living room talking to a visitor. Behind the people who live there is a huge and terrifying monster. And they say to the visitor, "We deal with it by talking about it." So we laugh because that's what we do. We deal with problems by talking about it, and we're going to talk about it, we're going to talk about it. But actually, I want to honor that. And that's why this gathering is so important. Superb people coming together and talking together about hard problems raises consciousness, sharpens analysis, elevates critique, identifies lines of inquiry, and that's how we make progress. So I commend you for your efforts. I wish I could stay. If you have other cartoons or other insights, please let me know. Good luck.
Thank you very, very much, Dean Minow. We're now going to the second half of the second topic, the second part of the program, and we're going to begin with Claude Canizares, Vice President for Research at MIT.
Well, thank you, David, and many thanks for organizing this in the first place and for giving me the chance to join. It's been a remarkable morning, and I look forward to the other talks this afternoon. In the meantime, I'll give you a little interlude from the front lines where, frankly, I deal with conflict of interest issues every day, sometimes a significant part of every day. As David mentioned this morning, MIT was founded as a land-grant institution, not to promote agriculture, like most of the land grants, but rather the so-called industrial arts. In the words of MIT's founder, William Barton Rogers, and I quote, "The interests of commerce and the arts, as well as of general education, call for the most earnest cooperation of intelligent culture with industrial pursuits." And by intelligent culture, I presume he meant the university, although some may question that. This earnest cooperation has, in fact, persisted throughout MIT's 150-year history, but it's changed significantly, and even significantly in the last few decades. One of the major components of our industrial engagement is through industry sponsorship of research. Today, industry sponsorship accounts for about 16% of our $700 million of sponsored research. That's for the MIT campus, and in that I exclude MIT's Lincoln Laboratory, which does another $800 million of research, but it's a federally funded research and development center, and so is entirely federally funded. The industry percentage actually rises to 20% if you include direct sub-awards from industry, but that involve pass-throughs of federal funds. Conversely, although federal funding is still by far the majority of our research funding on campus, it's now at an all-time low of 69% of the total. And that's down from over 90% throughout the post-World War II period up until the 1970s. These percentages, by the way, I believe are fairly high compared to most of our peers, with the exception of a few institutions that do a significant amount of clinical trials. The past 3 decades have also seen another component added to MIT's earnest cooperation with industrial pursuits, namely our role in fostering startup companies through the licensing of new technology, most of which, of course, emerges from the federal research. The passage of the Bayh-Dole Act in 1980, which gives universities ownership of intellectual property, which is derived from the federally sponsored research, greatly accelerated, of course, the licensing activities at all institutions, including MIT. And here I must profoundly disagree with Professor Fisher, because I believe this is actually a very good thing and not something that should be repealed. And maybe we can get into a debate about that later in the question period. Today, MIT is awarded something like 150 to 200 patents per year, and we issue roughly 100 licenses. Those account for about 20, or in a good year, 25 new startup companies each year that spin out of the research activities. Many of the founders of these startups are MIT faculty and/or their former students or postdocs. And annual revenue from licensing and royalties grosses somewhere between 80 and 100, in a good year, maybe $150 million a year, but that's the gross. The net and the return to the institution is smaller than that. But an important thing which I would like to state is that this financial return is actually not the driver for the commercialization. It's the commercialization itself which is the driver. In fact, there is no budgeted number in our operating budget presumed from licensing any year. From year to year, it could be zero, or we hope that at least it pays for costs. Generally, we've done better than that. And even in the end, it represents a very modest part of our operating budget. There's a third component of our earnest cooperation as well, of course, and that's been referred to already, that industry can be an important source of philanthropy, and it is for MIT, but although it's still, of course, a minor component compared to other sources. Altogether last year, 700 companies provided research or gift support to MIT. 175 were funded more than $100,000, and over 40 more than $1 million. The largest sponsor companies, to give you a scale for sponsored research, are in the neighborhood of $10 million each. Another thing that's been alluded to already, of course, is that besides money, earnest cooperation also includes the roles that leaders of industry play as MIT trustees, members of visiting or advisory committees, advisors to topical consortia around materials or energy, and other such roles. Conversely, MIT's faculty and senior officers serve as directors or advisors for companies large and small, although I should say, because of some discussion that was made earlier, is that MIT faculty, officers, employees are forbidden from holding any line management positions in their companies, so that when faculty start companies, they either take a leave, which they can do for a couple of years, and then either come back or leave permanently, or they can only be in advisory roles or as directors. They can't be line managers in any other company, whether it be their startup or anything else. In the interest of full disclosure, which is popular today, I myself serve on the board of directors of a major corporation. There's one area of earnest cooperation in which MIT does not engage, and that's the direct conduct of clinical trials to ascertain the safety or the efficacy of drugs or devices. Although MIT researchers are very active in the biomedical sciences and engineering, including significant work on therapeutics, drug delivery, and devices, we have no medical school and no affiliated hospital. And so while we, of course, conduct human subjects research of various kinds, it's always at earlier stages. And if there are clinical trials that are necessary, those must be done in collaboration and through an institution that is used to doing that. And I can't resist, because I had thought, and I know we all hope that Chuck Vest could join us today, of telling a little story about that he told me when he was trying to decide whether to leave the University of Michigan to come to MIT. Jerry Wiesner, who was already mentioned this morning by President Bach, gave him 3 reasons why he should make that trip, the same trip that Jerry had made some years earlier. No law school, no medical school, no big-time football. So whether or not Jerry was thinking of this conflict of interest at the time, the advice worked, and Chuck did come. And we wish he could be here with us today. The lack of a medical school means that MIT is slightly less exposed, possibly, to the extreme scrutiny that's placed on medical colleges. But we certainly have plenty of engagement with biotech companies. There are 140 of them that I could walk to comfortably from my office. And these include both major pharma and biotech companies. But I would also submit that when we do studies of the environmental safety of nuclear power plants or the impact of hydraulic fracking, that is probably as politically sensitive and subject to public scrutiny as our clinical trials, and probably that will be increasing. As I'm sure President Rawlings knows, that the current economic and social conditions that have already been alluded to a little bit this morning have really only exacerbated the pressures on universities to engage with industry. These pressures come from elected officials, taxpayers, and leaders of industry themselves, often in the well-intentioned but misguided hope that these will create new jobs in the very near future. The public and state universities, as has already been mentioned, are under probably the greatest pressure as legislators both slash budgets for education on the one hand and then demand more return on investment on the other. There have been a whole series of reports from the National Research Council, PCAST, the Department of Commerce, industry associations, the Kaufman Foundation, all calling on universities to do more and to do it faster. Dozens of university presidents, including my own, but not Harvard, signed on to a letter that was authored by Mary Sue Coleman of the University of Michigan, in which they pledged to redouble their efforts to encourage the transfer of research products into the commercial sector. And again, for full disclosure, I was a member of the National Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship, which helped author that letter. And I know that David Korn has taken some objection to it, so maybe he'll raise that again in the question period. And I also believe that the pressure to help the economy, for universities to engage more with the economy, is exacerbated by the growing public frustration at what is widely perceived as an uncontrolled and inexorable growth in the cost of tuition. Professor Cole already mentioned this morning the issue of whether the cost model for universities is sustainable. Thanks to Baumol's cost disease, universities' pricing is in fact, probably on an unsustainable trajectory, and many university leaders look to commercial engagement as one way to assuage this public frustration. So our challenge, as that of our peers, has always been how to balance and reconcile the unavoidable tensions between what I see as two competing goods, namely the preservation of the sanctity of the academic enterprise, as has been stated much more eloquently by the previous speakers, and that's on the one hand, and on the other hand, the desire to earnestly cooperate with industry to transfer the fruits of our research to society. So I would actually take exception with characterizing this as an issue of primary and secondary objectives. At least I think in the halls of MIT, it would be argued that they are both primary objectives. Part of our mission is indeed transferring the fruits of our research to society as effectively as possible. Despite the strong attention to working with industry, MIT unequivocally sees itself, first and foremost, as a university devoted to sound, unbiased scholarship and grounded firmly in the same traditions that gave rise to this great institution over 200 years ago, 200 years earlier than ours, many more than 200 years ago. Underlying principles are the same as those that have already been articulated: a firm commitment to open, unfettered education, exploration of new knowledge, open, unencumbered publication of results, impartiality and independence from inappropriate biases, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, as with all other universities, these are the prerequisites for the trustworthiness that forms the sine qua non of our reputation and our effectiveness in doing everything, including transferring our fruits to industry. A recent faculty committee that re-examined conflict of interest in research reiterated that despite our strong commitment to working closely with industry, MIT's overriding responsibility is to ensure that the external financial business relationships of MIT and its officials do not compromise our research, teaching, outreach, or other activities. To my knowledge, few, if any, of those many reports that urge greater engagement of universities with industry even raise the question about how to balance that goal against the overriding need to preserve the values of openness and independence that underlie trustworthiness. So like our peers, MIT, of course, relies on a collection of policies and practices that seek to separate the investigators responsible for the design, conduct, and reporting of research from the reality or perception of financial considerations, either personal or institutional. There are officers and trustees of the Institute disclose potential conflicts and are separated from decisions that might be perceived as conflicted. Our endowment is managed by an investment company that is at arm's length entirely from the academic enterprise, et cetera. MIT's Technology Licensing Office does indeed sometimes take equity as well as royalties, or in place of royalties from startup companies. But we then are careful about any other follow-on engagement between MIT and the company, and if necessary, we'll divest ourselves of the equity to avoid a potential conflict of interest. Here, I think, again, that diversity can be a strength. The fact that we have a great many licenses and a great many companies means that there's a really fairly low barrier to divesting any one of them. As for our many corporate sponsors, we adhere to some very bright lines that we will not cross. And the Olivieri case just really spotlights, I think, the importance of some of these. We always insist on retaining complete freedom to publish and categorically refuse any attempt the companies may make, and sometimes do, to get prior approval. And by the way, the government is also another source often of attempts to put prior approval on publications, and we will not accept those either. We do allow prior review for patentable information or inadvertent inclusion of proprietary information, which is very narrowly defined in those agreements. We insist that MIT owns the intellectual property invented by our researchers, or jointly owns it if it's jointly invented. Individual companies are given options for royalty-free, non-exclusive licenses or royalty-bearing exclusive licenses with carve-outs for research, but only at the time the technology is identified, not in advance. And by the way, our faculty are not authorized to sign contracts. Contracts are only signed by a small number of authorized officials for the university after being reviewed. There are also other arrangements which I won't go into detail, but would be happy to discuss in the question period. Our insistence on these principles has caused us on numerous occasions, in fact, to walk away from a number of potential sponsorships, some of them quite lucrative, and in several cases involving major corporations of the Fortune 100 Dow Jones variety. In some cases, again, I think the diversity, as was mentioned this morning, can be a strength. The fact that we have so many industrial sponsors makes us less dependent on any one or two and makes it easier to walk away from those that try to make us cross the line. Although I will say that explaining that to the individual faculty member whose research will not go forward is not one of my most pleasant tasks. I do question, and I think the discussion this morning really highlighted whether or not that is enough, whether these policies, these practices are enough. And we've agreed that we need to sort of pull them together a little more clearly than we may have in the past. And I think the more subtle potential effects on decision-making that, in fact, the Dean just mentioned a few moments ago, the desire to please sponsors or donors are the kind of less tangible conflicts that are much, much harder to manage. There are already signs that the strong economic pressures that I referred to earlier are beginning to cause some erosion, especially because of the heavy pressures on public universities. Within the last year, both the University of Minnesota and Penn State announced new policies that give corporate sponsors greater rights over sponsored research, including in some cases the ownership of all the IP that comes out of that research. The University of Michigan announced last spring that it was using its endowment to co-invest, that it would use its endowment to co-invest in the startup companies of its faculty, raising some of the issues that President Bach mentioned in his examples this morning. These are understandable, again, and well-intentioned responses to the external pressures that I've described, but I fear they may become the very first steps on a very slippery slope. So to return to where I began, I firmly believe in MIT's earnest engagement with industry. I think it's a very important part of our success and our impact as an institution. It is a part of our mission, so that we need to treat it with the same respect as the sort of independent scholarship and transmission of new knowledge, which is another part of our mission. They are the competing goods, and I think so far we've been successful, knock on wood, in walking the tightrope and maintaining the balance between them. But this is a very dynamic process, and it is true that there's a difference. The amount of industrial engagement can be turned up or down, can be modulated without major impact. The loss of trustworthiness is probably more or less a one-time event, and once lost, it will be extremely difficult to regain. And I think that incommensurate aspect between these two competing goods is an important driver, of course, of the discussion today. So one thing that I do believe, and I hope will come out of this meeting, is a much greater understanding of how we can continue to guard and preserve the values that lie at our core. Thank you.
We have 5 minutes in the 30-minute allotment. If anybody has any questions they wish to ask.
Jim Snyder for the Software Center. The question is, how effective is this diversity of funding sources in breeding the type of independence? So just to give you 2 examples, newspapers claim that they have lots of advertisers, and so it all balances out. Scholars tend to be very skeptical of that argument. They note the car dealers and cigarette companies or whatever it is, the supermarkets have common interest, and it actually biases the coverage. Or in the think tank world, they list all of their funders, and it looks like, oh, you have a diversity of funders, it's independent, but actually when you get to it, the individual programs only have a few funders, and they have a profound influence. So when you talk about the diversity of funders, it's very much how you package it. by groups, by programs. What looks to be on the surface very diverse may in reality be anything but. So anyway, do you address that, the individual centers at MIT? To what extent are they really diverse? Because that may be really the most relevant unit of analysis for diversity of funding resources.
Well, that's an excellent point, and I would not dispute it at all. I think it is true that, as a class, and you could make the class as big as you want. It could be industry, or it could be, energy companies, or it could, and so, yes, I think those classes. By the way, one class would be the federal government, because that's another sponsor, and there's another whole issue about universities and their dependence on the federal government, which is much bigger than dependence on industry in the first place. So I think that is something that also has to be managed in its own right, and diversity does not help that issue. Diversity only helps in the case of particular individual sponsors who are trying to get something even more special than all the others have, and that's the only place that really the diversity, I think, is a strength.
Yes?
This is partly a specific question and partly a more general one that I sort of want to get out on the floor. The trustworthiness of the research that goes on in universities is partly a matter of the integrity of the actual research and the researcher. But it's also more generally a feature of the culture of the university, a general culture of skeptical, engaged critique across all of the disciplines, and a general idea that people are talking to each other and that ideas are being subject to criticism and critique. Whose responsibility is it to pay for that?
To pay for that?
Well, to create to support humanities departments, for example, all the rest of the university that ideally ought to be contributing to the fact that this is not just a place where smart people are doing good research that characterized by integrity, but in which people are engaging with each other's research, criticizing each other's research, bringing broader societal considerations into play.
Yes.
All of that is going on. That ought to be part of what underlies the trustworthiness of university research. But how does that happen?
Well, I would not dispute that at all. I would agree with that, and I think I think it was Professor Cole who said something this morning as well about the importance of the humanities and I would say the social sciences. But those are sponsored research. It will not pay for everything in the university, first of all, and in fact, something that I have to keep reminding my faculty of, we actually lose money on everything that we do, including education and including research. Larry, did you want?
Can I actually jump in here on this one?
Yeah, right here.
On this issue of how does the institution pay for the humanities, I think it's a very good one. I just wanted to remind you that in 1999, we received, at the time I was still at MIT, the largest gift in the history of the Institute. It was a $100 million gift, and it was unrestricted. And we could devote it to whatever we wanted. And what was interesting is that the decision was made at the time to devote the vast bulk of it, $75 million, to the School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences, specifically understanding that this was a unique opportunity to make an investment of resources that the Institute otherwise wouldn't, in part because there wasn't the kind of sponsored research activity that would support the humanities. So I think institutions often express their preferences and their real underlying preferences in the actions that they make. At that point, MIT, I think, concluded that's what was important.
Yeah, and the only other thing I was going to add was that we have quite a few research activities now that explicitly bring in not just the scientists and the engineers, but people from the School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences to bring that perspective into our research. And our energy initiative, for example, and our environmental work, that is very much the case. So they are actually at the table at the time we're talking about these things.
Sure, yeah, thank you. I was thinking, can it really be as perfect as you're making it sound? And then I thought, well, think of an example. And I wonder if you could comment briefly on the experience of Ted Postal and the very intense and prolonged controversy that he was involved in at MIT involving military-related research, and Lawrence Liver, anyway, Raytheon, and you know.
Sure, sure. It was an issue around missile defense. I'd be happy to talk to you offline. Let me just say that he raised some allegations. They were investigated by two separate groups and found not to have merit. But you know, he has other opinions about
Right.
this, and he
Right.
has been, despite the fact that we have a significant amount of federal funding, there have been no restrictions on his ability to.
Right, no, the conflict issue would have to do with the investigation part of it, I think, yeah.
Why don't you two fellows follow up privately?
Sure.
I'm trying very hard not to let
keep
it
us on
slip too
top.
much.